The most powerful people in human history may never have existed. Not kings. Not presidents. Not generals. And not the founders of great empires. Because if power is measured by how long you can shape the way people think, then some of the most influential figures ever created were fictional. That sounds absurd at first. After all, how can someone who never walked the earth influence reality more deeply than someone who ruled it? But that question hides a much bigger mystery. Think about it for a moment. Entire empires have disappeared. Borders have shifted. Languages have evolved. Political systems that once seemed permanent now survive only in textbooks. Yet somewhere in the middle of all that change, a lonely knight charging toward a windmill still lives in our imagination. A child standing beside a rose still changes the way people think about love. A traveler listening to a river still influences how people search for meaning. A former prisoner offered an act of mercy still shapes conversations about justice. Why? Why do these figures remain alive long after the worlds around them have vanished? Most people assume stories reflect reality. But what if that assumption is backwards? What if stories don't simply describe reality? What if stories help create it? That possibility is far more unsettling than it sounds. Because it means the greatest literary heroes were never competing with villains, armies, or even society itself. Their real opponent was something much larger, the lens through which human beings interpret existence. And that changes everything. A king can command behavior. A law can enforce obedience. An institution can regulate actions. But none of those things automatically change the way a person sees the world. A story can. And once a perception changes, something remarkable happens. The same reality suddenly produces different choices, different values, and sometimes an entirely different future. This is where the contradiction begins. The heroes we celebrate in literature often look strangely ineffective by conventional standards. They don't conquer continents. They don't build lasting political systems. They don't leave behind armies or corporations. Yet their influence refuses to die. Why would civilization keep carrying these figures forward century after century if they failed to achieve what history usually calls success? Maybe because success was never their purpose. Maybe their true role was something far more powerful. Not world builders. Mind builders. And that brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Human beings do not experience reality directly. We experience reality through stories, symbols, assumptions, and meanings. Through invisible frameworks that tell us what matters, what is valuable, what is beautiful, what is worth sacrificing for. In other words, we don't merely live inside the world. We live inside interpretations of the world. And every once in a while, a fictional character appears and quietly rewrites one of those interpretations. A windmill becomes a question. A rose becomes a responsibility. A river becomes a teacher. A pair of silver candlesticks becomes a challenge to everything we think we know about justice. These are not just literary images. They are cognitive tools. Memory fragments embedded in culture. And the deeper mystery is this: if fictional characters can survive the collapse of empires because they reshape the way people see reality, then perhaps the most important battles in human history were never fought over land, wealth, or power. Perhaps they were fought over perception itself. And if that's true, then the question is no longer why we still remember these heroes. The question is what they discovered about reality that civilization still hasn't finished understanding. Before we can understand why these characters endure, we need to confront a deeper assumption that most of us never question. We tend to believe that reality comes first, and stories come second. A nation rises. A war is fought. A technology is invented. Then someone writes a story about it. Simple. Logical. Almost obvious. But what if that sequence is incomplete? What if human beings have always needed stories before they could even understand the events happening around them? That possibility changes the entire conversation. Because the real conflict surrounding these literary figures is not fiction versus reality. It is interpretation versus reality. And those are not the same thing. Every civilization develops tools to organize the chaos of existence. Laws do it. Religions do it. Philosophies do it. Economies do it. Stories do it too. But stories possess a strange advantage. They can bypass arguments and speak directly to perception. A law tells you what to do. A story changes what feels true. And once something feels true, behavior often follows. This is where the first major contradiction appears. The modern world tends to reward practicality, efficiency, measurable outcomes, tangible results. Yet many of the most influential literary heroes appear profoundly impractical. A knight who mistakes ordinary objects for something greater. A child who takes an invisible bond more seriously than visible possessions. A seeker who abandons borrowed answers. A redeemed man who refuses to let his identity be defined by society's labels. From a purely practical perspective, none of these seem like formulas for success. And yet they survived. Not because they solved problems. Because they exposed assumptions. That distinction matters. A solution addresses a specific moment in history. An assumption shapes generations. A solution can become obsolete. An assumption can quietly govern an entire civilization. This may explain why certain symbols continue to follow us across centuries. The windmill. The rose. The river. The silver candlesticks. Look closely and something unusual emerges. These symbols are not remembered because of what they are. They are remembered because of what they force us to question. The windmill asks whether reality is always what it appears to be. The rose asks whether value comes from ownership or devotion. The river asks whether wisdom can ever be possessed. The candlesticks ask whether a human being can become more than their past. Notice the pattern. Each symbol acts like a doorway. Not toward answers. Toward perception. And perception is where civilizations are quietly built. This creates a scale shift that is easy to miss. Most people think cultural change begins in institutions. But institutions themselves emerge from beliefs. Beliefs emerge from values. Values emerge from meanings. And meanings are often carried by stories. In other words, the deepest layer of power may exist far upstream from politics, economics, or technology. It may exist inside imagination. That idea becomes even stranger when we consider the legacy of these characters. Very few people can accurately describe the political structures of the centuries in which these books were written. But millions still understand what a windmill represents. Millions still understand what a rose represents. How is that possible? How can a symbol outlive the world that created it? Perhaps because symbols are portable forms of meaning. Empires require territory. Symbols require memory. And memory travels farther. This leads us closer to the central mystery. If these literary heroes are not important because of what they accomplished, but because of how they transformed perception, then perhaps we have been measuring influence incorrectly all along. Maybe the most consequential figures are not those who control what people do. Maybe they are those who reshape what people believe is possible, meaningful, or true. But that raises a far more unsettling question. If stories can alter the lens through which entire generations interpret reality, then who, or what, is shaping the stories that define our perception today? If stories help shape perception, then a troubling question immediately follows. Why do some stories reshape us while others disappear? Every year, thousands of books are published. Countless characters are created. Most are forgotten almost instantly. Yet a small handful continue to move through centuries as if they have escaped time itself. What makes them different? The obvious answer would be quality. But that explanation falls apart very quickly. History is filled with brilliant works that faded into obscurity. At the same time, certain symbols seem almost impossible to erase. They continue traveling from generation to generation, crossing languages, borders, religions, and political systems. Something deeper is happening. And this is where the central contradiction begins to emerge. We often assume that civilization is built upon certainty, stable institutions, stable laws, stable definitions, stable truths. Yet the literary figures we have been exploring do not offer certainty at all. They introduce doubt. The knight forces us to doubt what is real. The child forces us to doubt what is valuable. The seeker forces us to doubt what we think we know. The redeemed man forces us to doubt how we judge one another. In other words, their influence does not come from providing answers. It comes from destabilizing assumptions. That seems backward. Should not great cultural heroes provide clarity? Perhaps. But perhaps the deepest transformations begin with confusion. Because certainty protects existing systems. Questions challenge them. And questions can survive longer than answers. Consider the scale of that idea. A government can establish a definition of justice. A generation later, that definition may change. A society can establish a definition of success. A generation later, that definition may collapse. But a question about justice can survive for centuries. A question about meaning can survive for millennia. That is why these characters operate differently from historical leaders. Historical leaders often influence decisions. Perception-shifting heroes influence frameworks. And frameworks determine how future decisions will be made. The difference is enormous. One shapes an event. The other shapes the lens through which countless events are interpreted. Now the conflict becomes more visible. Civilizations require stability. But human consciousness requires exploration. Civilizations need shared realities. But growth often begins when someone challenges those realities. This creates a tension that never fully disappears. The tension between order and imagination. Between consensus and vision. Between utility and meaning. And the most enduring literary heroes seem to live precisely at that intersection. Not because they resolve the conflict. Because they embody it. Look again at the memory fragments that have survived. A windmill. A rose. A river. A pair of silver candlesticks. These objects are strangely ordinary. None possess obvious power. Yet each functions like a crack in the surface of accepted reality. A reminder that another interpretation may exist. A reminder that the world is never fully settled. That may be why these symbols remain emotionally alive long after the societies around them have changed. They address a permanent human problem. Not how to live, but how to see. And here the consequences become much larger than literature. Because if perception shapes values, and values shape institutions, then changing perception may eventually reshape entire cultures. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But gradually. Quietly. Across decades and generations. Which leads to a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the most influential stories are not those that tell people what to think. Perhaps they are those that alter the structure through which thinking itself occurs. If that is true, then these characters are not merely cultural artifacts. They are cognitive technologies. Tools that modify how human beings interpret reality. And once that possibility enters the conversation, an even deeper mystery appears. If these enduring figures gained their power not by controlling people, but by changing the invisible frameworks inside their minds, then where did those frameworks come from in the first place? And who discovered that a story could become more powerful than a system? Before asking who discovered the power of stories, we need to confront an even more fundamental revelation. What if the enduring influence of these characters has nothing to do with the characters themselves? What if we have been looking at the wrong place all along? The deeper pattern begins to emerge when we stop treating these figures as heroes and start treating them as instruments. Not instruments of entertainment. Not instruments of morality. Instruments of perception. This is the hidden role that connects a wandering knight, a child from another world, a seeker beside a river, and a man transformed by compassion. Their lasting influence does not come from what they achieve. It comes from what they make impossible to ignore. Each one reveals a blind spot in ordinary consciousness. And that may be their true purpose. Consider how unusual this is. Most systems attempt to reduce uncertainty. They provide rules, categories, definitions, and conclusions. They tell people where things belong. Stories like these do the opposite. They create productive instability. They loosen assumptions that have become invisible through repetition. The knight exposes the danger of believing that consensus automatically equals truth. The child exposes the danger of confusing measurement with meaning. The seeker exposes the danger of collecting knowledge without transformation. The redeemed man exposes the danger of reducing human beings to labels. These are not narrative functions. They are diagnostic functions. They reveal distortions hidden inside perception itself. And here a deeper insight appears. Perhaps the reason these figures survive is because the problems they address never disappear. Technology changes. Governments change. Economies change. Human perception remains vulnerable to the same traps. We still mistake familiarity for truth. We still mistake utility for value. We still mistake information for wisdom. We still mistake judgment for understanding. This means the true conflict is larger than any character, larger than any book, and even larger than any culture. The conflict exists inside consciousness itself. It is the tension between seeing and merely looking. Between understanding and merely knowing. Between awareness and assumption. Suddenly the memory fragments take on a different meaning. The windmill is no longer an object. It becomes a warning about the limits of certainty. The rose becomes a reminder that significance cannot be measured. The river becomes a symbol of reality as process rather than possession. The silver candlesticks become evidence that identity is not fixed. Each symbol functions like a compressed philosophical technology. Small enough to fit inside memory. Powerful enough to alter interpretation. This creates a consequence that extends far beyond literature. A civilization is not only built from roads, laws, institutions, and inventions. It is also built from invisible assumptions about what matters. Those assumptions determine what people pursue, what they fear, what they admire, and what they are willing to sacrifice. Change those assumptions and eventually everything else begins to move. That is why stories can outlive systems. Systems organize behavior. Stories organize meaning. And meaning sits upstream from behavior. This is the revelation that begins to transform the entire discussion. The enduring power of these literary figures may not come from teaching people how to live. It may come from teaching people how to interpret existence itself. Yet even this revelation leaves one crucial mystery unresolved. If these characters function as tools that reshape perception, then perhaps the most important question is not why they survived. The more unsettling question is this: what exactly were they trying to prepare us to see that ordinary perception could never see on its own? What were these figures trying to help us see? The answer may be far stranger than most readers realize. Because the deepest revelation is not that these characters teach wisdom. It is that they expose a hidden fact about human reality itself. Human beings do not live inside the world. Human beings live inside models of the world. That distinction changes everything. A mountain exists. A river exists. A city exists. But the meaning of those things does not exist independently. Meaning is constructed, interpreted, negotiated, inherited. And most of the time, we mistake our interpretation of reality for reality itself. This is the blindness these characters were designed to confront. Not political blindness. Not intellectual blindness. Perceptual blindness. The inability to recognize that the lens has become invisible. This is the core revelation hidden beneath the symbols. The knight matters because he reveals how easily people confuse consensus with truth. The child matters because he reveals how easily people confuse value with measurement. The seeker matters because he reveals how easily people confuse knowledge with understanding. The redeemed man matters because he reveals how easily people confuse identity with history. Notice what connects all four. Each exposes a different illusion. And each illusion remains active today. That is why these characters continue to feel alive. They are not speaking to the past. They are diagnosing the present. The true role of these figures was never to provide a better answer. Their role was to reveal a deeper question. A question hidden beneath ordinary consciousness. What if the reality you experience is partly shaped by assumptions you did not choose? This is where the entire pattern suddenly locks together. The windmill. The rose. The river. The silver candlesticks. These are not merely literary symbols. They are operating systems for perception. Compressed frameworks that teach people how to interpret experience. A civilization can inherit them without even realizing it. A child encounters them. An adult remembers them. A culture absorbs them. And eventually they become part of the invisible architecture through which reality is understood. That is why their influence feels disproportionate to their stories. They are doing something larger than storytelling. They are modifying perception itself. Now the scale expands dramatically. If enough people begin viewing dignity differently, justice changes. If enough people begin viewing meaning differently, culture changes. If enough people begin viewing identity differently, institutions change. The transformation always appears external in the end. But its origin is internal. The visible change arrives last. The invisible change arrives first. This may be the most overlooked truth in literature. Stories rarely change the world directly. Stories change the people who later change the world. And because that process unfolds across generations, it is almost impossible to see while it is happening. That is why empires often overestimate their own importance. They focus on controlling territory. Stories focus on shaping interpretation. Territory can be lost in a decade. Interpretation can persist for centuries. Which leads to an even deeper philosophical realization. Perhaps the most powerful force in civilization has never been military strength, political authority, wealth, or technology. Perhaps the most powerful force has always been meaning. Because meaning determines what human beings are willing to build, defend, sacrifice for, and pass on. And if that is true, then these enduring literary figures were never simply characters. They were carriers of meaning. Vehicles through which civilizations preserved questions too important to lose. But that realization creates a consequence that is impossible to ignore. If stories become the containers through which cultures transmit meaning across centuries, then their greatest legacy is not what they teach. It is what they make future generations capable of seeing. And that raises a question far larger than any individual book, symbol, or hero. What happens to a civilization when it forgets how to create stories that expand perception and begins creating stories that only confirm what people already believe? The consequence of losing perception-expanding stories is not merely cultural decline. It is something much quieter and, in many ways, more dangerous. It is the gradual shrinking of human imagination. Not imagination in the sense of fantasy, but imagination as the ability to perceive possibilities beyond what appears immediately obvious. This is where the legacy of these enduring figures becomes visible. Their greatest achievement was never changing the world around them. Their achievement was preserving humanity's ability to question the world around them. And that legacy comes with a cost. Every perception-shifting figure stands in opposition to something deeply comforting: certainty. Certainty reduces anxiety. Certainty simplifies decisions. Certainty creates order. Yet the figures we have followed through this journey leave us with something very different. They leave us with ambiguity. The knight leaves us uncertain about reality. The child leaves us uncertain about value. The seeker leaves us uncertain about knowledge. The redeemed man leaves us uncertain about judgment. Their inheritance is not comfort. Their inheritance is awareness. And awareness carries a price. Once a person begins questioning inherited assumptions, returning to complete certainty becomes difficult. This creates a fascinating paradox. The stories that enrich consciousness often remove the illusion of simplicity. They do not make the world smaller. They make it larger, more layered, more mysterious, more demanding. That is why their influence continues long after the final page. The real transformation happens outside the story. It happens when a reader encounters a difficult decision years later and suddenly remembers a rose, or a river, or a pair of silver candlesticks, or a windmill standing against the horizon. These fragments survive because they become part of the mental architecture through which future experiences are interpreted. They stop being literary symbols and become tools for navigating existence. The scale of this legacy becomes clearer when we shift from the individual to the civilization. Every culture inherits stories. But beneath those stories, it also inherits ways of seeing, ways of defining dignity, ways of understanding responsibility, ways of approaching uncertainty, ways of imagining what a human life can become. These invisible inheritances often outlast political systems, economic structures, and historical events. A government may survive for decades. A perception can survive for centuries. That is why the deepest influence frequently operates below the level of headlines and institutions. It lives inside assumptions so familiar that they become invisible. This leads to a consequence that reaches directly into the modern world. A society that loses the ability to question its own assumptions may become efficient. It may become technologically advanced. It may become highly organized. But it risks becoming intellectually and spiritually stagnant. Because progress does not begin when people find better answers. Progress often begins when someone asks a better question. And that has always been the hidden legacy of perception-shifting figures. They keep certain questions alive. Questions about truth, meaning, identity, compassion, freedom. Questions that no generation fully resolves. Questions that each generation must rediscover for itself. The memory fragments endure because the questions endure. The windmill still turns. The rose still waits. The river still flows. The silver candlesticks still cast their light. Not because they belong to the past, but because they continue speaking to something unfinished in human nature. And perhaps that is the final consequence of all. These stories reveal that civilization is not only a collection of answers handed down through history. It is also a conversation sustained by unanswered questions. Which leaves us with a paradox that remains unresolved. If the most enduring cultural legacies are not answers but questions, then what does it mean that the questions we inherit may shape our future more profoundly than the answers we create? Perhaps the most enduring insight is not about literature at all. It is about what kind of creature a human being truly is. We often describe ourselves as rational beings, political beings, economic beings, social beings. Yet beneath all of those descriptions lies something even more fundamental. Human beings are meaning-making beings. We do not simply react to reality. We interpret it. We search it for patterns. We transform events into stories, stories into values, and values into identities. That is why certain figures never seem to disappear. Not because they belong to the past, but because they continue participating in that process. They remain present wherever human beings struggle to understand themselves. And perhaps that is what the strongest symbols have always been doing. A windmill standing against the horizon. A rose protected not because it is rare, but because it is loved. A river moving endlessly while somehow remaining itself. A pair of silver candlesticks quietly illuminating a dark room. These images endure because they speak a language older than argument. They reach the place where people form meaning before they form conclusions. Long after facts are forgotten, symbols continue working beneath the surface. Long after historical details fade, certain questions remain alive. Not because they have no answers, but because every generation must answer them again. This may be the true legacy of the figures we have followed. They do not tell us what to think. They remind us that thinking itself is an unfinished process. They do not provide permanent certainty. They preserve the capacity for wonder. And wonder may be far more important than certainty. A civilization that loses wonder can still accumulate information. It can still increase efficiency. It can still expand its technology. Yet something essential begins to fade. The ability to see beyond immediate utility. The ability to recognize meaning where measurement cannot reach. The ability to encounter mystery without immediately trying to eliminate it. That loss is difficult to detect because it does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. One assumption at a time. One unquestioned certainty at a time. One forgotten question at a time. Which is why the deepest contribution of these enduring figures may not be intellectual at all. It may be existential. They preserve spaces inside the human mind where uncertainty can coexist with wisdom, where humility can coexist with understanding, and where meaning can remain larger than explanation. Their lasting significance does not come from solving the human condition. It comes from protecting the conversation surrounding it. And perhaps that is why they continue to travel across centuries while so many powerful institutions fade into memory. Institutions often seek permanence. Questions remain alive because they are never fully finished. In the end, what survives is not always what was strongest. Sometimes what survives is what remains relevant to the deepest parts of human experience. A windmill. A rose. A river. A light shining from a pair of silver candlesticks. Not answers. Invitations. Invitations to see differently. Invitations to notice what familiarity has made invisible. Invitations to remember that reality is never experienced directly, but always through the meanings we create around it. And perhaps the most important question is not whether these figures changed the way previous generations saw the world. Perhaps the more important question is whether there are still questions, symbols, and stories capable of changing the way we see ourselves before it is too late to notice that our vision has narrowed at all.